Good afternoon and welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today at the University of Minnesota China Center's Considering China webinar, Reimagining the Second Sino-Japanese War with Animals, with Ding-Ru Huang, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Minnesota. I'm Joan Brzezinski and I direct the China Center at the university. We're so happy to have you here. There will be a Q&A session directly following the presentation. So submit your questions that you may have throughout the program with the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we'll answer as many questions as we can as possible at the end of the program. Professor Huang received her PhD in Chinese literature and Master of Arts in Regional Studies and East Asia from the Harvard University and a BA from Tsinghua University. She recently joined the faculty here at the University of Minnesota. Her research and teaching engage in literary modernism, wartime cultural production, post-humanism, and environmental humanities in China and global East Asia, with particular attention to roles played by non-human animals. Today, Professor Huang will reimagine the human experiences of the Second Sino-Japanese War from the perspective of non-humans. Welcome, Professor Huang.
Thank you, John, for this wonderful introduction. And I would also like to thank China Center, John and Haiyan for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure and honor. Also, thank you to the audience for coming to my talk during your precious lunchtime. So the title of my talk today, let me share my screen. Wait. Sorry, I need to share with sound because I have two video clips. Let me know if you can't see my screen, okay?
Looks fine.
Wait. Okay, so the title of my talk today is Beyond Allegories, Reimagining the Second Sino-Japanese War with Animals. So how do we remember a war? Sometimes a war is remembered through a chronology of victories and defeats, preluded by the Manchuria incident in 1931 and the Shanghai incident in 1932. The Second Sino-Japanese War broke out on a full scale in 1937 and ended with Japan's unconditional surrender in 1945. The war is one of the most traumatic and consequential historical events in 20th century China and East Asia. Even today, we're still negotiating its lasting geopolitical, ethical, and cultural impacts. The impact of the war is often measured by great numbers. For example, the number of deaths resulting from the war is estimated between 20 to 37 million. Powerful as they are, sometimes these numbers render the lived wartime experience to be even more unfathomable. War memories are, of course, also preserved in wartime and post-war literature and media, which embody the complexity of wartime experiences beyond chronologies and numbers. The cultural landscape in 1930s and 40s China has often been mapped upon a split topography. Ideological topography, including Japanese occupied zones, the nationalist party-governed areas, and the communist spaces. As a result, writers and artists are categorized by their left or right-leaning political stances and their collaboration, passivity, or resistance vis-a-vis the Japanese forces. In recent years, scholars have revealed that this divided cultural landscape was indeed constantly being reconstructed by highly mobile actors who trespass these divisions. My research follows these border-crossing actors and places them in a more than human ecology. This ecology involves actors such as war animals and machines that shaped human behaviors and environments. I propose to revisit the legacies of the war from an ecological perspective and ask, in a time of destruction, conflict, and division, how can we envision recuperative connections with human and non-human others? This is my big burning question, my barbecue today. Last year, 2025, marked the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II and the end of the Second Sino-Japanese War. Some of you may have watched the military parade that celebrated this anniversary in China on September 3rd. I did. At the end of the parade, 80,000 live pigeons were released into the Tiananmen Square within 90 seconds. These pigeons were recruited through the Beijing Pigeon Association from pigeon enthusiasts across the city. Great efforts were made to create this photogenic moment. It was not only to send a message for peace, but also to demonstrate the capacities and techniques for organization and display. For long hours, pigeons were kept in cages without food or water. Some became exhausted and disoriented soon after the release. Some even fell into rivers on their way back home. It is, of course, not uncommon to mobilize symbolic animals in ceremonies like this to demonstrate state power. And it is certainly not unique to China. This episode, however, reminds us of the living bodies, human and non-human, that constitute such glamorous moments with historical and political significance. In other words, we need to see both the pigeons in the sky and the pigeons in the water. The living body of the non-human will be at the center of today's talk. We'll be thinking with animals, allegorical and live animals that populate literature and films from and about the Second Sino-Japanese War. In the rest of today's talk, I will first briefly talk about the rise of animal allegories or allegorical animals at the turn of the 20th century, which was interconnected with the spread of evolutionary thinking and national crisis. I'll then turn to three case studies, a poem, a film, and a novel. Each text centers on one animal and will generate one keyword for today. I will talk about corporeality through the poem about a pigeon, companionship through a film about a cow, and animal consciousness through a novel about an elephant. So corporeality, companionship, and consciousness, 3 C's for today's talk. These are, of course, heuristic divisions used for expediency, or what we say in Chinese, 方便法门. There are, of course, far more aspects of human-animal interactions beyond what we can cover today. I argue that when these aspects are foregrounded, we may find a path beyond allegories, a path towards weak anthropocentrism, which I will explain at the end of today's talk. At the turn of the 20th century, animals were often evoked to illustrate national crisis in the colonial world order. Their bodies, powerful or weak, easily lend themselves to a graphic imagination of imminent dangers of imperialist invasion and the partition of the homeland. The newly acquired knowledge of evolution not only blurred the ontological divide between human and non-human animals, but also triggered anxieties over racial degeneration and extinction. One could easily draw a parallel between the struggle for survival in the relentless natural world and the geopolitical arena with a racialized hierarchy. In 1898, with the memory of China's humiliating defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War still fresh, a Hong Kong newspaper published a map of the current situation. This is a later rendition of the map, with imperialist forces embodied by animals such as bear for Russia and eagle for the US, surrounding Chinese territory. Around the same time, following the failure of the 100 Days Reform and his exile to Japan, Liang Qichao published an essay titled On Animals in Qingyi Bao. And this time, the animals turned from embodiments of the imperialist orders to self-images. In this allegorical essay, Liang Qichao includes 4 stories about 4 animals. The whale in Hokkaido, Japan, who remains complacent as the whalers dwell on their back, slicing its flesh for food and burning its oil for light. The fish in Italy, whose eyesight degenerates because of disuse, in darkness, and is doomed to be extinct. The sheep in Paris who docilely walk into a killing machine and end up with their flesh washed clean and split. And finally, a lion-like machinic monster in the museum, which used to have mighty power but is now rusted through and useless. This last image has been considered one of the important sources for the popular metaphor that compares China with dormant power to a sleeping lion. 睡狮. Ari Heinrich has traced this imagery back to an automaton called Tipu's tiger, which depicts an Indian tiger mauling a British soldier. In Liang's time, this piece was already robbed from India and displayed at the British Museum, turning from an anti-colonial message to a trophy of British colonial power. And all these 4 foreign animals were adopted by Liang to give his countrymen cautionary tales about the urgency of national enlightenment and struggle for survival. Animal allegories for national crisis and salvation continued to thrive in wartime China in the early 20th century. Following the 1931 Manchuria incident and the 1932 Shanghai incident, Lao She published his novel Cat Country. The narrator of the novel is a human astronaut whose spaceship crashed on Mars. There he encounters the cat people, humanoids with cat faces. A caricature mirror image of Chinese people at the turn of the 20th century, these cat people similarly suffer from poverty, drug addiction, corrupt elites, and malfunctioning bureaucracy. Maybe some of you may think this is not so different from our world, right? The novel concludes with the destruction of the cat country by an unnamed foreign invasion. Compared to this pessimistic tone in Cat Country, 猫城记, Chen Zhice's play Bird Country, 鸟国, portrays the bird country's defense against the beast country, which clearly refers to Japan, but this time in a more positive light. It was first staged in an open-air theater in Dingxian County as part of the literacy campaign over there. During the climax of the play, actors wearing headpieces that represented different kinds of birds ran from the stage into the audience, urging them to join the resistance against the beasts. So what happened when we shift our focus from these allegorical animals to living bodies of animals in wartime literature? We will now follow one particular pigeon back to 1930s Shanghai, whose story connects 2 men. On the one hand, the Chinese literary giant Lu Xun, on the other, Nishimura Makoto, the biologist turned journalist from Japan. Although the 2 men had never met, they in fact shared more commonalities than they were probably aware of. Lu Xun and Nishimura were born 2 years apart towards the turn of 20th century and witnessed a drastic change in East Asia. Still grappling with the ideas of enlightenment, modernization, revolution, and of course, rising nationalism and imperialism. They both spent their formative years overseas. Lu Xun studied medicine in Japan, whereas Nishimura received his PhD in biology from Columbia University in the US. Both men took a surprising turn in their career trajectories. Lu Xun famously turned from medicine to literature as his lifelong vocation. Nishimura, while teaching biology at Hokkaido Imperial University, found a new career at the Osaka Mainichi Shimbun newspaper and became a prolific popular science writer and travel writer. Intellectually, both men were impacted both by evolutionary biology and Buddhist philosophy, a significant yet not uncommon combination at the time. The day was February 6, 1932, almost exactly 94 years ago. By then, a Sino-Japanese military conflict known as the Shanghai Incident in Japan and the January 28th battle in China had lasted for more than a week. Lu Xun, who according to his diary felt threatened by the sound of gun firing and bombing, and moved his entire family to a bookstore in the British concession in Shanghai. On the same day, Nishimura, who had just been sent to Shanghai as the leader of a humanitarian medical service team, was walking through the war-ruined city. As he passed the Three Fidelities land, Sanyi in the main battleground, he spotted a startled pigeon in the ruins. Nishimura brought the pigeon back to where he stayed and named it Sanyi, or Three Fidelities. Sanyi the pigeon then traveled with Nishimura as a medical service team operated in Qingdao, and then in Dalian, and eventually arrived in Nishimura's home in Osaka, Japan. In Osaka, Nishimura sometimes brought the pigeon to his lectures on the Shanghai Incident as a piece of living evidence and a silent witness to the brutality of the battle. At home, he kept Sanyi, the Chinese pigeon, with a Japanese partner with the hope that they could breed a hybrid pigeon that embodies Sino-Japanese friendship. This wishful thinking, of course, seems to be naive, to say the least, with Japan's ongoing colonial expansion and military aggressions in China. Unfortunately, in the following year, the pigeon died before it could actually give birth to the symbol of Sino-Japanese friendship. Saddened by its ominous death, Nishimura built a burial mound and erected a memorial stupa for the pigeon, which is called Sanyi Ta. He then sent a letter to Lu Xun, the Chinese writer he admired, to share the pigeon story. In return, Lu Xun wrote him back with a classical Chinese poem titled Ti Sanyi Ta, or Inscription for the Stupa of the Three Fidelities. In Nishimura's letter to Lu Xun, he included a sketch of Sanyi, which is accompanied by a Japanese waka poem. The poem depicts a loving scene of two pigeons sharing one nest. Although they are from two countries, one in the west, one in the east, the little pigeons become intimate with each other, sharing one nest. Now, Nishimura was clearly not exactly a sophisticated poet. However, different from the poem, there is only one pigeon in the sketch. In the accompanying inscription, Nishimura captures the moment when he first saw the pigeon in war ruins. He uses an uncommon Buddhist term, memon, to describe the lost and miserable look of the pigeon, which seems jarring when juxtaposed to the lovely, heartwarming poetry. In the poem, Lu Xun composed in response, he also evokes the moment of the encounter between Nishimura and the pigeon. The poem reads as follows. I will just read the Chinese part. You can read the translation on the screen. 奔庭飞燕兼人子，拜景颓垣胜恶鸠。偶值大兴离火宅，中移高塔念瀛洲。惊情梦觉仍闲时，斗士成间共抗流。渡尽劫波兄弟在，相逢一笑泯恩仇。Some of you might find the last couplet especially familiar, especially 相逢一笑泯恩仇. In the opening line, the word Lu Xun chose to denote mortal man literally means the son of man, 人子. And this corresponds with the hungry dove in the second half of the couplet, emphasizing the equal vulnerability of human and non-human animals under the bombing and gun firing. The third line contains two Buddhist references, the merciful heart and the burning house. The latter refers to the world filled with suffering, an allusion from the Lotus Sutra. In fact, the first half of the poem is reminiscent of the Buddhist allusion that the Buddha, in the past lifetime, saves the pigeon by feeding his own flesh to a hawk. The Buddhist imagery takes a turn as Lu Xun evokes the mythical bird Jingwei from the classic of mountains and seas, Shanhai Jing, a 4th century Chinese mythological text. According to the text, Jingwei was the daughter of Emperor Yan, who transformed into a bird after being drowned in the Eastern Sea. As an act of revenge, she carries pebbles with her beak, trying to fill up the sea. And this legend is often evoked to describe a firm resolution, but inevitably tinted with a sense of futility, because imagine how can you fill up a sea with pebbles? In the context of the poem, the figure of the human-turned bird indicates both the dove and its human companion. In other words, the hungry dove and the merciful heart become one in this line. The implied hope is that the regretful memory of the dove will transform its human companion into a fighter who goes against the tide and flood of history. The politically ambiguous intimacy suggested by Nishimura's poem is here transformed by Lu Xun into a radical solidarity, which in turn constitutes a charged brotherhood across national borders and enemy lines in the last couplet. The poem has been interpreted by some scholars as evidence of Lu Xun's revolutionary optimism, 革命的乐观主义精神. Taking its Buddhist connotations into consideration, however, the poem is probably not as optimistic as it might seem. The term 劫波 in the last couplet, which can be literally translated as a calamitous wave, is also a transliteration of the Sanskrit word kalpa, meaning the period of time from the beginning to the end of the universe. As suggested by the image of the tireless bird who attempts to fill up a sea with pebbles, the tide and flood of history could not be simply turned around by some well-intended individuals like Nishimura. As opposed to what Laurent Blount terms a cruel optimism, which describes misplaced belief in unachievable fantasies, especially in neoliberal contexts. I will argue that Lu Xun's poem contains a sympathetic pessimism, through which he recognizes hope and its fragility at the same time. The implications of the pigeon poem can be further revealed if we position it in a genealogy of cultural imaginations about the pigeon in China. While pre-modern cultural imaginations remained in 1930s China, wartime media tended to emphasize the pigeon's role as a prosthetic creature for the war machine, rather than embodiments of virtues. As early as in 1920, Chinese media had started introducing the use of war pigeons in Japanese military exercises. In 1930, the military magazine reported that there were at least 17,000 carrier pigeons in Japan, which could be drafted as war pigeons at any time. During the Shanghai incident in 1932, both Japanese and Chinese armies mobilized a large amount of war pigeons. It is worth mentioning that the Chinese army just purchased its carrier pigeons from Japan the year before and hired a Japanese pigeon trainer. San Yi, the pigeon found in the ruins following the battle, might not be an innocent Chinese civilian pigeon. Following the battle, it was reported that Chinese civilians in Shanghai found Japanese war pigeons mingling in local pigeon flocks. Stories of pigeons' flexible loyalty extended to the aftermath of the war, when the Japanese war pigeons were recruited by the Shanghai police station, forming a communication and surveillance network that covered the entire city. Indeed, what differentiated the war pigeons of the 1930s from their pre-modern counterparts is that they are often seen as a replacement of or a supplement to a mechanical communication system. The contrast between the hungry pigeon in Lu Xun's poem and the weaponized pigeons reveals the uneven distribution of life and death, nurturing and killing taking place in wartime East Asia. Unfortunately, but not surprisingly, Nishimura's story with the Chinese pigeon was later co-opted by the imperialist discourse of Nichu Xingzhen, or Sino-Japanese amity. This concept was closely related to Japanese pan-Asianism, which was evoked to justify colonial expansion and especially coercive erasure of cultural and linguistic differences between the colonizers and the colonized. Despite its past use in colonial contexts, however, the story of the pigeon was once again revived following the normalization of Sino-Japanese relations in 1972. Lu Xun's poem continued to be cited by Chinese national leaders in recent years when speaking of cross-strait relations or the two Koreas. They always cite the last couplet of the poem. We remain brothers when the ravaging surges all abate. On reuniting with one smile, we wash away the hate. 相逢一笑泯恩仇. In the name of brotherhood, the poem was evoked to smooth out uneven power relations and mark the shifting alliances in post-war East Asia. While the last couplet remains familiar in today's cultural memory, the rest of the poem has become obsolete. I hope today's talk brings us back to the corporeality of the hungry bird, back to the moment of the human-non-human encounter captured by Nishimura's sketch and by the opening couplet in Lu Xun's poem. 奔庭飞燕兼人子，带景颓垣胜恶鸠. In contrast to the pigeons incorporated and consumed by the war machine, the pigeon San Yi appears in Lu Xun's poem first and foremost as a starving bird, a living being deprived of its essential need due to the war. The pigeon knows hunger just like the Son of Man knows death. This corporeal knowledge becomes a foundation of a fragile kinship, a brotherhood across national and even species borderlines. Now let's fast forward to 2009. Gang Hu's film Cow or 斗牛 was released this year. At the center of the film, we have mortal man, and instead of a hungry bird, we have a hungry and foreign cow. It is not a typical film reflecting the Second Sino-Japanese War. Many critics compare it to the more well-known film by Jiang Wen called Devils at the Doorstep or 鬼子来了 for its comedic elements. Both films shift their focus away from the glorified themes of patriotism and heroism or graphic depictions of Japanese atrocity to the existential absurdity and the darkness at the core of the war. The film Cow, or 斗牛, opens as a human protagonist, Niu Er, returns to his village, only to realize that the whole village has been massacred by the Japanese. It is in this moment of despair and fear he encounters the other protagonist of the film, the cow. Here is the scene where the cow is first introduced. The cow here is framed by ruins and is shot from a lower angle, which elevates its figure and highlights its immensity and austerity. Flashbacks then explains that the cow belongs to the communist aid-route army, Balu Jun, who has entrusted the cow to the villagers for protection. The milk of the cow has been an important source of nutrition for wounded soldiers. To protect the cow from the inspection of the Japanese, the villagers have painted it yellow to make it look more Chinese, more like a Chinese cow, only to further highlight its foreignness. A short newsreel inserted toward the end of the film introduces the backstory of the cow.
1937. The world was haunted by war. People here carefully cultivated a quality breed of growing and dairy cows and sent them to the front line of the anti-fascist war. These cows were seen in both the Spanish camp against Franco and the distant battlefield in China. We appreciate the free will and unselfish spirit of the Dutch people. The anti-fascist front needs support from freedom-loving people the world over.
This foreign cow, this Dutch cow, becomes Niu-er's only companion throughout the film. Together, they encounter the Japanese soldiers, Chinese refugees, bandits, and one nationalist soldier. All these encounters feel kind of alienating and threatening to them, as the cow's nurturing nature constantly subjects it to exploitation. The camera sometimes wanders into the cow's perspective, but does not linger too long, refusing to provide the illusion that we can actually see from the cow's point of view. The film scholar Yan Hongzhang notices the recurrent shots of the cow's gaze throughout the film, as Niu-er is, quote, as Niu-er is frequently seen to question the meaning of that look by asking, "What are you looking at?" or to refuse the pressing look of non-comprehension from the cow by saying, "Don't look, what is there to look at?" Unquote. Borrowing John Berger's phrasing, the cow's look or gaze highlights a narrow abyss of non-comprehension between human and non-human beings. And in the context of the film, also the incomprehensibility of the war to both protagonists. In some interviews, when asked what the cow symbolizes, the director Guan Hu suggests that the cow's silent endurance seems to embody some sort of Chineseness. And yet, the foreignness or alterity of the cow is emphasized throughout the film, from the opening scene to the newsreel at the end. The cow refuses to be seen merely as a symbol for the resilient Chinese people, although that remains a possible interpretation. From the start of the film, the protagonist Niu-er is portrayed as a guangguer, an unmarried man with no kids, a marginalized loner and dispensable member in his own community. As the film unfolds, a strange kinship formed between Niu-er and the cow. He treats the cow sometimes as a surrogate maternal figure and sometimes as a stand-in for his past lover, Jiu-er, which makes some audience members uncomfortable. And this is a kinship unrelated to reproduction or the continuation of a lineage. At the end of the film, Niu-er asks a Chinese soldier to write the epitaph for his grave. Being illiterate, he mistakenly arranges the characters as the grave of two cows instead of the grave for Niu-er. Predetermined death equates Niu-er and the cow. In this final gesture, the film extends grievability to the non-human beings through an uneasy companionship, still fraught with non-comprehension and alterity. Now we are turning toward our last case study, The Elephant from Wu Mingyi's 2015 novel, The Stolen Bicycle. At the center of the narrative is an elephant that connects three human characters. Binai, a Karen elephant tamer from Burma. Pasuya, an indigenous Seoul Taiwanese who is drafted to fight for the Japanese. And finally, squad leader Mu, a nationalist veteran who moves to Taiwan following the Chinese Civil War. The fates of these three men from different sides of the war are brought together because they each take care of the elephant Ling Wang as part of their wartime experience. The elephant Ling Wang exists both fictionally within the narrative and historically as a famous veteran elephant and then a zoo star. In 1942, Ling Wang's herd was first deployed as war elephants in Burmese jungles by the Japanese army. then captivated by the Chinese army. They travel through the long Burma Road and then endure a long journey through Yunnan, Guizhou, Guangxi, and Guangdong. 6 of the elephants from the herd died along the way. The survivors not only took part in the construction of a monument for martyrs, human martyrs, but were also made to perform in circuses to raise funds for disaster relief. In 1947, Lin Wang was brought to Taiwan by Sun Liren, a nationalist army general. As a dark irony of history, after Lin Wang ended up in the Taipei Zoo, Sun Liren was also placed under house arrest. Back to the fictional elephant. Wu Mingyi, the novelist, arranges a reunion between the elephant and the squad leader Mu, who used to accompany Lin Wang through his long journey from Burma to Guangdong. They are reunited in the Taipei Zoo. The moment of recognition is powerful. Finally, Lin Wang laid the tip of his trunk, soft and warm, on the hand of the palm that lacked 3.5 fingers. They recognize each other by shared woundedness. This reunion brings back their wartime memories. In the chapter titled Limbo, the author allows us a glimpse into the elephant's sensorium and consciousness. It opens as follows. 象从梦中醒来，眼前的森林一片火光，尖锐前所未闻的咻咻声穿过林梢，每个闷声都伴随着几棵树着火，烟雾四起，温暖的吓人。太阳一样明亮的金色火球在几分钟内不断升起落下。Although narrated from the elephant's perspective, it is still in third person. The chapter continues. The abyss of non-comprehension between the human and the non-human beings still exists. But this time it is observed from the elephant's perspective. 当长老母象倒地时，其他的象完全停步，围绕着它。它们用长鼻摩挲着彼此的背，发出不可思议的轻柔低哼声。夜晚气温逆转，较接近地面处形成较佳的传音层，那低哼声因此得以传到远方的山谷，而后有嗡嗡回响传回营地。那被放大的多层次的音响，让一旁的士兵感到凄怆而温暖。他们体会到了象的伤心，也因此为自己伤心起来。他们想起了远方的情人与亲族，死去的同僚，曾经握着阳具与枪的断臂，以及不可能再长出来的眼珠。In the rest of the novel, the reader learns how the war has consumed and reshaped the bodies and minds of the human and non-human animals that have constituted its biopolitical mechanism and its ecology. Wu Mingyi describes his approach to non-human beings as a weak but intent gaze. He claims that his writing is always driven by his unease and ignorance. In the different contexts, he describes his stance as weak anthropocentrism. According to Byron Norton, the eco-critic who coined the term, this self-reflexive position is based on the human subject's considered preference rather than merely felt preference. He defined considered reference as follows. A considered preference is any desire or need that a human individual will express after careful deliberation, including a judgment that the desire or need is consistent with a rationally adopted worldview. A worldview which includes fully supported scientific theories and a metaphysical framework interpreting those theories, as well as a set of rationally supported aesthetic and moral ideals. As you can tell, this is a position that's very difficult to achieve. The considered preference is always in negotiation with felt preference. To take a weak anthropocentric position means to always be ready to take on values formed and informed by contact with nature, and adjust one's own perspective. As a human subject casts a weak but intent gaze on the non-human other, the non-human being may also return the gaze and in turn reshape the human subject. Wu Mingyi acknowledges the challenge or even impossibility to move beyond or move away from anthropocentrism as a human being, and as a writer writes in human language, evoking scientific and metaphysical knowledge created by and serving for human beings. To take a weak anthropocentric stance is to recognize the limits of the very medium of literature, human language. As Ian Miller describes in Nature of the Beasts, elephants are highly intelligent, emotionally complex mammals whose physical characteristics and social attributes arouse human curiosity and emotional attachment. This is probably why Wu Mingyi chose to place the elephant at the center of this novel. By the way, Ian Miller's book is a fantastic work which discuss the wartime perceptions and treatments of animals from the Japanese perspective, which we don't get to cover today. When we return to the paragraph from the Limbo chapter, we notice that elephants are never anthropomorphized. The promise and peril of mutual comprehension between human and non-human beings lies in their shared loss, grief, and pain. Here, animal consciousness is not grasped as an object of knowledge, but is rather taken with a leap of faith, rendering the human subject vulnerable for the limits of their own emotional and intellectual capacities. In recent years, more fiction writers have become interested in the more than human aspects of the war. Two brilliant examples are Zhang Guixin's 2018 novel Wild Boars Cross the River, 野猪渡河, which focuses on the Southeast Asia battlefield of World War II, and Gan Yaoming's 2021 novel 民不弄成为真正的人, which explores the Sancha-shan incident toward the end of the war in Taiwan. It also includes some beautiful episodes with the Formosan clouded leopard. To conclude, through the stories of the pigeon, the cow, and the elephant, we see how paying attention to the corporeality, companionship, and consciousness of non-human animals can help us see beyond their allegorical and symbolic values. These non-human actors can be understood as nexuses in networks of human and non-human relations, where the historical, the material, and the symbolic are brought together by the force of lived reality. Together, they reveal genuine yet fragile connections between human and non-human, which are generated by and contribute to wartime conditions of precarity. And this brings us back to the question I have posed at the beginning of today's talk. How do we envision connections in a time of destruction, conflict, and division? The answer that has emerged from today's talk is that we need to develop a weak anthropocentric sensibility to approach the abyss of non-comprehension between human and non-human beings, the promises and perils of affinity and companionship, as well as the risk of falling into a colonizing mindset of an all-encompassing unity. This, I think, can be the foundation for us to reimagine the relationships with human and non-human others in the hot and cold wars at the present. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dingru. I think John will be reviewing the questions, right? Hello, John. Meanwhile, from the audience, if you have any questions, you're welcome to submit that using the Q&A feature on the lower navigation bar. Joan is not allowed to turn on her camera. Oh, okay. I can help with that.
So sorry. I was locked out. But here I am. So yes, let's do some Q&A if anyone has any questions. But in the meantime, I'd like to thank Professor Huang for her discussion today. It was really fascinating look at this use of animals in our re-examining history on that level. I think that's very fascinating. Thank you. Um, so, other questions? Anyone? Could you say more about the archival work involved with the research on your literary texts?
I think we got a question from the audience. So could you say more about the archival work involved in your research on literary texts?
Dinro cannot unmute herself. We're having some webinar issues today. Hi, Yan.
Yes, Dinru, you can try again.
I am back. Thank you, Yanqing, for your question. It's about the archival work involved in my research. So particularly with the case of the pigeons. So I went through Republican era magazines in the 1930s and earlier to trace this genealogy of war pigeons. And I also went to Japan for archival work in the National Diet Library. They also have a very rich archive for wartime magazines. And they even have journal for war animals. So very rich resources to research with. So my research is still continuing, and if anyone in the audience has some interesting examples you would like to share, I'll be very happy to be contacted. There's another question about
Did you
publish your
prepare
book?
to publish your book for with your search, or?
Thank you for asking. Yes, I'm working on that book. Hopefully I can finish it soon. Yeah, so the book will be both about animals and machines used in the war and how they constitute the wartime ecology, and how writers and intellectuals sometimes they have to position the human condition in relation to non-human others, not only animals but also machines. So hopefully I can finish writing that book soon. Thank you for the question.
Other questions? Well, I'd like to thank you for your presentation today, and thanks for your support.
There's one more question.
One more question, and here it is. I'm always astonished at the incredible restraint used in describing the 1930s Manchuria and Shanghai encounter as incidents. It really takes a huge leap of sincere desire to move ahead after those almost completely ignored historic events, at least from the perspective of Western historic studies. I really look forward to your book. It's a comment more than a question. But yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's important to point that out. And it use incidents for, of course, following some academic traditions. But of course, these are battles, and there are human costs and non-human costs as well. And but it's not only the battle at the center, but long time entanglements, geopolitical entanglements in the region. So that's part of the reason to describe it as incidents. But thank you for pointing that out. And in fact, the quote unquote Shanghai incident has been remembered in China as 一二八战役, January 28th battle. So yeah, that might be a more proper name for the incident. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Thanks to everyone here for your support of the China Center Considering China webinar series, and a special thanks to Kai Mei and Joseph Terry for their generous support of this program. We invite you to help us provide these kinds of programs and more engaging discussions with a gift to the China Center. You may do so through the link in the webinar announcement or on our website. Wish everyone here a very good and happy and fortunate upcoming year of the horse. And we hope that you enjoy your day. Thank you so much, Professor Huang.
Thank you.